In the 1970s, a Catholic priest made a claim that should have been impossible. He said, the Vatican had built a machine that could see the past, not predict it, not interpret it, see it. According to him, they had already used it to observe ancient Rome, to hear speeches that had been lost to history, to witness events no one had seen for thousands of years, and even to watch the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, not as a story, not as a belief, but as something that had actually been seen and recorded. The device had a name, the Chronovisor, and if what he claimed was true, then history was no longer something we could only study. It was something we could revisit, something we could replay. Moments we thought were gone were not gone at all. They were still there, waiting. But the claim didn't come from a scientist or an inventor. It came from a priest, Father Pellegrino Ernetti, a man trained in theology, in music, in ancient texts, not someone you would expect to be building machines. And yet, he insisted that this device existed. Not only that, he claimed it had been developed in secret, with the help of other scientists, hidden from the public, and ultimately locked away because of what it meant. Because if the Chronovisor were real, it wouldn't just change history, it would rewrite it. It would remove interpretation, remove uncertainty. It would replace belief with direct observation. And that raises a question, not about what happened in the past, but about what we would do if we could see it. Because some events are not just historical, they are foundational. They shape entire belief systems, entire civilizations. And if those moments could be watched, again, who would control that? Who would decide what is seen and what is kept hidden? And more importantly, why would something like this never be revealed? The claim of the Chronovisor did not come from a fringe theorist or an unknown voice. It came from a man who had spent his life inside the church. Father Pellegrino Ernetti was born in Italy in 1925. He grew up in a country shaped by tradition, religion, and the weight of history. From an early age, he showed a fascination with the past, not just reading about it, but understanding it, the languages, the culture, the details most people would overlook. That path eventually led him into the Benedictine order, a life defined by discipline, study, and devotion. But Ernetti was not a typical priest. He was a scholar. He specialized in ancient languages, Latin, Greek, texts that had survived in fragments or been lost entirely. He became particularly interested in something unusual, the reconstruction of ancient theatre, plays that had been performed thousands of years earlier, but no longer existed in full. Ernetti believed that with enough knowledge, enough context, it was possible to rebuild those performances, to bring them back as accurately as possible. And this is where his thinking began to shift, because in trying to reconstruct the past, he started asking a different question. Not how to rebuild it, but whether it had ever truly disappeared at all. According to Ernetti, everything that happens leaves a trace. Every sound, every word, every moment, not just in memory, but in the physical world itself. He believed those traces remained, fading over time, but never completely gone. And if that was true, then perhaps the past was not something we had lost. Perhaps it was something we simply could not yet access. Ernetti's work and reputation brought him into contact with other scholars, scientists, engineers, people working at the edge of what was understood at the time. And according to his account, that is where the idea of the Chronovisor began to take shape, not as a fantasy, but as a problem to be solved. If the past leaves traces, then how do you capture them? If those traces exist, how do you isolate them? And if you can isolate them, could you reconstruct what actually happened? These were not questions of belief. They were questions of possibility. And Ernetti claimed they found answers. If Ernetti's claim was to be believed, then the question was no longer whether the past could be accessed, but how. According to him, the Chronovisor was not a traditional machine. It was not built to project images. It was built to receive them. Ernetti described it as a device capable of capturing the residual energy of past events. The idea was simple in theory, but almost impossible in practice. That every action, every sound, every movement produces energy, waves, frequencies, and that those waves do not simply disappear. They dissipate, they weaken, but they continue to exist somewhere. If that was true, then the past was not gone. It was still present, just beyond our ability to perceive it. The Chronovisor, according to Ernetti, was designed to detect those traces, to isolate them, and then reconstruct them into something visible. He claimed the device used a combination of antennas, sensors, and highly specialized receivers, equipment tuned to pick up specific frequencies, not from the present, but from the past. By selecting a time and a location, the device could focus on a particular moment, filtering out everything else. And what remained was an image, not a recording in the modern sense, but a reconstruction of what had once existed. He described it as watching through a window, not traveling through time, but observing it. A view into events that had already happened, but had never truly disappeared. According to his account, the team began with small tests, fragments of sound, short sequences, moments that could be compared to known historical records. And as their confidence grew, so did the ambition of what they attempted. Because if the device could capture a voice, then it could capture a scene. And if it could capture a scene, then it could capture history itself. The implications were enormous, because a machine like this would not just observe the past, it would verify it, remove interpretation, remove uncertainty. It would show events exactly as they happened. But that is also where the problem begins, because if history can be observed directly, then it can also be challenged. Beliefs, narratives, entire systems built on interpretation, all of them would become fragile. And that raises another question. If a device like this were real, would it ever be made public? Or would it be kept hidden for the same reason it was created? If the Chronovisor existed, then it had to be tested, not on legends, not on events that could not be verified, but on moments where there was something to compare against. According to Ernetti, that's exactly what they did. They began with sound, short fragments, voices, words spoken in the past that had been recorded in written form. The idea was simple. If the device could retrieve those sounds, and they matched what was already known, then it was working. He claimed the first successful results were small, not full conversations, not complete recordings, just fragments, but fragments that aligned with historical texts. And that was enough to continue, because if even a portion of the past could be accessed, then the implications were already clear. From there, they moved to something more complex. Not just sound, but images. Moments that had been described in detail. Events where historians believed they knew what had happened. According to Ernetti, the Chronovisor began to reconstruct those scenes. At first, unclear, distorted, like looking through something incomplete. But over time, the images sharpened, and the idea of simply hearing the past became something else. They were watching it, observing events as they unfolded. Not imagined, not recreated, but experienced, as if through a distant window. He claimed they focused on moments that could be verified. Ancient theatre performances, scenes from Roman history, events where records existed but had never been seen. And in those moments, they believed they had confirmation that what they were seeing matched what had been written. Not perfectly, but closely enough to suggest they were not guessing. They were observing. And once that line was crossed, everything changed. Because if the device worked even once, then there was no longer a limit to what it could be used for. The past was no longer distant. It was accessible, and the question was no longer, can it be done? But what do you look at next? As the experiments continued, the scope of what the chronovisor was used for began to expand. No longer limited to fragments, no longer limited to events of minor historical importance. According to Father Ernetti, the team made a decision to observe something far more significant. Not just a moment in history, but one of the most important events ever recorded, the Crucifixion of Jesus Christ, an event that has been studied for centuries, described in Scripture, debated by historians, interpreted through faith, but never witnessed in the way Ernetti claimed was now possible. To attempt something like this, they would have needed precision, a moment in time, a location. Because if the chronovisor worked as described, it would not simply show the past at random. It would require direction, a specific point, in this case, Jerusalem, and a period believed to be somewhere between 30 and 33 A.D. The time historians associate with the crucifixion, a place known as Golgotha, a location that has been studied, debated, and never fully confirmed. And if those coordinates were correct, then what they were attempting to observe was not just history. It was one of the most significant moments ever recorded. According to his account, they focused the device. At first, the image was unstable, distorted, shadows without clarity, movement without form. But gradually, it began to resolve. What they were looking at was no longer abstract. It was a scene, a gathering, a crowd, figures moving, voices present, but indistinct. And at the center of it, a man. Ernetti claimed the figure matched the descriptions found in Scripture. A body weakened, a posture consistent with crucifixion. But what stood out was not just the event itself. It was the presence of detail, subtle movements, expressions, moments too small, too human to be recorded in text. And then, according to Ernetti, they did something even more significant. They captured an image, a still frame, a face. What he claimed was the face of Christ. The image was later published in Italy, and for many, it became the most controversial piece of evidence linked to the chronovisor, because while some believed it was authentic, others noticed something else. The face in the image looked strikingly similar to an existing sculpture, a known depiction of Christ created years earlier, which raised a difficult question. Was this proof? Or was it influence? Because if the image had been shaped by something that already existed, then what they were seeing might not have been the past at all. It might have been something else. Interpretation, projection, or even fabrication. And that is where the story begins to divide. Between those who believed they had witnessed history and those who believed they had created it. If the Chronovisor had been used to observe the Crucifixion, then it would not have been the only event they chose to witness. According to Father Ernetti, it was only one of many. Because once the device appeared to work, the question changed. It was no longer, can we see the past? It became, what do we look at next? Ernetti claimed that the team focused on events that could be compared to known history. Moments where there were records, descriptions, accounts that could be used as reference points. One of the areas he spoke about was ancient Rome, public speeches, political gatherings, moments that had shaped the course of Western civilization. He claimed they were able to observe figures delivering orations to crowds that no longer existed, not as reconstructed performances, but as living moments. The cadence of speech, the movement of the crowd, details that had never been written down, but could now be seen. They also turned their attention to ancient Greek theatre, plays that had been lost, performances that had only survived in fragments of text. Ernetti, who had spent years trying to reconstruct these works, claimed the Chronovisor allowed him to do something entirely different. Not rebuild them, but watch them. Actors on stage, audiences responding. The full performance, as it had once been. He described it as the difference between imagining something and witnessing it directly. And if that claim was true, then entire sections of cultural history had effectively been recovered. But the scope did not stop there. According to his account, the device was used to observe a wide range of moments across different periods. Events from the early church, moments tied to the formation of religious doctrine, scenes that had been debated for centuries, but never confirmed. There are also references, though less detailed, to observations of earlier civilizations, ancient cities, lost environments, places that no longer exist in the form they once did. But there is something about these claims that doesn't quite add up. Because if a device like the Chronovisor truly existed, then the possibilities would be endless. You wouldn't just observe fragments of history. You would go to the moments that define it. The assassination of Julius Caesar, the construction of the pyramids, the fall of empires, events where there are clear, unanswered questions, moments that could be verified beyond doubt. And yet, those are not the events Ernetti focused on. Instead, the claims return again and again to moments that are harder to verify, harder to prove, and in some cases, aligned closely with existing beliefs, which raises a difficult question. If the Chronovisor worked, Why wasn't it used to settle the biggest debates in history? Why not go to the moments where proof would be undeniable? Why not show something that no one could question? Because if a machine like this existed, it wouldn't just confirm history, it would end arguments. And that is exactly what never happened. So either the device was never used in that way, or it couldn't be. Or perhaps it was never capable of doing what was claimed at all. By this point, the story of the Chronovisor begins to shift. What started as a claim of discovery becomes something more difficult to define, because the more you look at the details, the more questions begin to emerge. There is no confirmed image of the device itself, no verified schematics, no physical evidence, nothing that can be independently examined. For something described as one of the most significant inventions in human history, that absence is difficult to ignore. According to Ernetti, the Chronovisor was built in secret, developed by a small group, and then taken apart, dismantled, hidden, or, in some accounts, destroyed entirely. But even that explanation raises another problem. Because if the device worked, if it could truly observe the past, why dismantle it? Why remove something that could answer questions humanity has been asking for centuries, unless the answers themselves were the problem? There are also inconsistencies in the story itself. Ernetti claimed the device required precise tuning, specific coordinates in time and space. And yet, there is no detailed explanation of how those coordinates were determined. No methodology, no reproducible process, nothing that could be tested. And then there is the image, the supposed capture of the face of Christ, presented as evidence, but quickly questioned, compared to known artwork, found to closely resemble an existing sculpture, which leaves two possibilities. Either the image was influenced by something that already existed, or the device did not produce what was claimed at all. And this is where the story becomes difficult, because it exists in a space between belief and evidence, too detailed to dismiss completely, but too incomplete to accept without question. And that tension is what keeps the Chronovisor alive, not as a proven invention, but as a possibility, one that raises more questions than it answers. If the Chronovisor did exist, then the most important question is not how it worked, it's who controlled it. Because according to Ernetti, this was not a private invention. It was developed within the orbit of the Vatican, one of the most powerful and historically influential institutions in the world. An institution built on continuity, on tradition, on the interpretation of events that shaped belief across centuries. And if a device like the Chronovisor were real, it would not simply reveal history, it would redefine it. Because the Vatican is not just a religious body, it is also a custodian of history, texts, records, interpretations that have been preserved. and passed down through generations. But interpretation exists because there is uncertainty, and uncertainty allows belief. If that uncertainty were removed, if key events could be observed directly, then interpretation would no longer be necessary. And that creates a problem, because some moments in history are not just historical, they are foundational. They define entire systems of belief. And if those moments could be seen without interpretation, then those systems would no longer rely on faith. They would rely on evidence. And that changes everything, because evidence can be challenged, reinterpreted, used in ways no one can control. And that is where another part of Ernetti's story becomes difficult to ignore. According to him, he was not working alone. He described a small group: scientists, engineers, specialists in fields that dealt with energy, signal, and communication, people capable of working at the edge of what was understood at the time. Some accounts go further, suggesting that individuals of significant scientific reputation may have been involved, even referencing figures like Enrico Fermi, a name that carries weight in the world of physics. But there is a problem. There is no confirmed record of his involvement, no documentation, no independent verification. And that pattern repeats. The team is described, but never clearly identified. Their expertise is implied, but never proven. Which raises another question. If a project of this scale truly existed, why is there no trace of the people behind it? Because building a device like the Chronovisor would not be the work of one man. It would require collaboration, knowledge, and coordination at the highest level. And yet, those individuals remain unnamed, unverified, almost as if they were never meant to be known. And if the people behind it remain hidden, then the device itself becomes even harder to accept, because without those people, there is no way to confirm what was built, or whether it was ever built at all. And that brings us back to the Vatican, because if a device like this did exist, the question becomes, would it ever be made public? Or would it be kept hidden? According to Ernetti, the decision was made. The device would not be revealed. Some accounts claim it was dismantled. Others suggest it was locked away, hidden within the Vatican archives, and never used again. But even that raises another question, because if the device was dangerous enough to hide, was it because it revealed too much? Or because it didn't reveal what was expected? Because a device like this would not just confirm belief, it would test it. And once that line is crossed, there is no way to control the outcome, which leaves us with a possibility, not that the Chronovisor was proven, but that it may have been too powerful to release. By this point, the story of the Chronovisor feels almost complete. A credible man, a device that could access the past, a series of observations. And yet, when you begin to look at it more closely, the structure starts to shift, because for something of this scale, something that would fundamentally change our understanding of history, there is remarkably little that can be confirmed. There is no physical trace of the device, no surviving component, no fragment, no blueprint. Nothing that can be examined, tested, or reproduced. And that alone would be unusual. But the inconsistencies go further. According to Ernetti, the Chronovisor required precision, a specific time, a specific place, coordinates that would allow the device to isolate a moment in history. And yet, there is no detailed explanation of how those coordinates were determined. No method, no system. Nothing that could be followed or repeated. Which raises a problem, because without a reproducible process, there is no way to verify the results. And without verification, there is no way to separate observation from interpretation. Then there is the question of the team. A project of this magnitude would require collaboration, experts in physics, in signal processing, in engineering. And yet, the individuals behind it remain unclear, suggested, implied, but never confirmed. Names appear and then disappear. Connections are made, but never supported, which leaves us with a strange situation. A device that required advanced scientific understanding, but no clear record of the people who built it. And then there is the matter of the image, the supposed capture of the face of Christ, presented as evidence, but quickly questioned, compared to existing artwork, found to closely resemble a known sculpture, which forces a choice. Either the image was influenced by what already existed, or the device did not produce what was claimed. And that is where the story becomes difficult to hold together, because every element relies on the others. If the device is real, the results must be real. If the results are uncertain, then the device becomes uncertain. And if the device is uncertain, then the entire story begins to collapse. But even that is not the end of it, because there is something else that doesn't quite fit the way the device was used. If the Chronovisor truly worked, then it would not have been limited. It would not have been selective. It would have been definitive. The biggest questions in human history would no longer be questions. They would be answers. The assassination of rulers, the origins of civilizations, moments that historians have debated for centuries, would be settled. And yet, that never happened. No definitive proof, no resolved debates, no moment where history itself was rewritten. Only claims, fragments, and a story that exists just out of reach, which leaves us with a final contradiction. The Chronovisor is described as a device that could reveal everything, and yet it revealed nothing that could not be questioned. And that is what keeps it alive, not as proof, but as possibility, because the story does not fail completely. It lingers, balanced between belief and doubt. And that balance is what makes it difficult to ignore. And yet, even after all the questions, all the inconsistencies, there is still a possibility. What if the Chronovisor was real? Not exactly as it was described, not perfectly understood, but real enough. Because history is filled with ideas that once seemed impossible, concepts that existed long before the technology to prove them. The ability to see distant worlds, to communicate across continents, to capture moments in time. All of them were once considered beyond reach, until they weren't. And if even a fraction of Ernetti's claim were true, then the implications would be immediate, because a device like the Chronovisor would not just change history, it would eliminate uncertainty. Every disputed event could be revisited. Every unanswered question could be explored. The rise of civilizations, the fall of empires, moments that shape the world, no longer dependent on interpretation, but on observation. And that would not just affect historians, it would affect everything, because history is not just about the past, it defines identity, belief, power. Entire systems are built on the way we understand what came before us. And if that understanding were replaced, then those systems would shift. Religion would be affected, not necessarily disproven, but challenged, because faith exists in the absence of certainty. And certainty changes how belief functions. Politics would be affected, because narratives shape power, and the ability to verify those narratives would reshape authority itself. Even personal identity would change, because the past is not just global, it is individual. Family histories, origins, stories passed down through generations. All of it could be observed, confirmed, or questioned. And that raises a deeper issue, because knowledge is not neutral. It changes behavior. It changes decisions. And once something is known, it cannot be unknown. Which brings us back to the same question. Not whether the Chronovisor could exist, but what would happen if it did. Because a device like this would not simply reveal the past. It would remove the distance between then and now. And that is where the real consequence lies. After everything that has been claimed, everything that has been suggested, what we are left with is not a clear answer, but a story built on fragments, on a single man's account, on details that cannot be fully confirmed and cannot be completely dismissed. Father Pellegrino Ernetti was real. His work, his background, his position within the church, all of it can be verified, but the Chronovisor itself remains just out of reach. there is no device to examine, no independent record of its construction, no demonstration that can be repeated. And yet, the claim persists because it sits in a space that is difficult to ignore, too detailed to be easily dismissed, but too incomplete to be accepted without question. And that is what makes it endure, because stories like this do not disappear. They evolve. They are retold, reinterpreted, passed from one generation to the next, each time adding something new or losing something old, until what remains is not just the original claim, but everything that has been built around it: belief, skepticism, curiosity, and the question itself becomes more important than the answer. Because in the absence of proof, possibility fills the gap, and possibility is powerful. It allows people to imagine what might be true, even when there is no way to confirm it, which is why the Chronovisor still exists, not as a machine, but as an idea, one that sits between history and imagination, between evidence and belief. And that is where it remains, unresolved, unverified, but never entirely forgotten. Imagine for a moment that the Chronovisor did exist, not hidden in the Vatican, not locked away, but built by someone with no authority to control it, no institution to contain it, just a device and a decision. Where would you point it? Because the moment you remove control, the purpose changes. It's no longer about preserving history. It's about uncovering it. The assassination of Julius Caesar, not described, but witnessed. The exact moment the blade was raised, the reactions in the room, the details no historian could ever record. The construction of the pyramids, not theories, not speculation, but the process itself, how they were built, who built them, and whether everything we think we know is actually correct. The Crucifixion, seen again, not through belief, but through observation. Would it confirm what has been written, or challenge it? The assassination of John F. Kennedy, a moment recorded, but never fully agreed upon. What actually happened in those final seconds? Was the story complete? Or was something missing? World War I, the decisions that led to it. World War II, moments that changed the course of the world. Orders given, choices made, events that still shape the present, because history is not just the past. It is the foundation of everything that exists now. And if you could see it, you would no longer need to interpret it. You would know. But knowing creates a different kind of problem, because once you remove uncertainty, you remove control. And control has always been part of history. Which brings us back to the same question. Not whether the chronovisor existed, but what would happen if it did. Because a device like this would not just change what we know, it would change who decides what is true. And that may be the most dangerous part of all.